Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about the film Ant-Man. One of the things about superhero movies in our current movie climate is that the origin story movie just doesn't feel as new, original, and fresh and as monumental as it used to. When there used to be an origin story movie, it'd be amazing that this superheroes finally got on screen and used to kind of understand that they had to go through all these things and set up all this stuff so that they could eventually make a franchise of films and that we wouldn't have to think about this stuff anymore. And when all there was origin story films, I think we accepted that more. And it's kind of like being into comics. You talk to someone who's into comics, their favorite comic isn't the origin story. It's usually like issue 57 or a crossover event or a big storyline or an arc. So we as audiences are kind of like people who are into comic books with comic book movies, I guess, in that we're kind of not as into the origin stories anymore. And I don't think the filmmakers are as into origin stories anymore because the kind of genre rules to just origin stories. You can't be as playful, you can't be as inspired, and most of them don't actually come out like the first Iron Man. They come out more like the two films that kind of tried to do it last year, like Big Hero 6 and the Ninja Turtles movie. They feel very rigid in sticking to those rules. And Ant-Man is more like one of those movies, and it's a little odd that Marvel would kind of go back to that. It feels like probably one of their less risky kind of structures from a studio that's actually kind of risky. And for a superhero that most studios probably wouldn't go to making a superhero like Ant-Man, and I'm sure Marvel, if Edgar Wright and all this development hadn't gotten involved, maybe he would have just been a secondary character. I don't know if they would have necessarily given him a solo movie. And instead of doing something radically different, they've kind of done something that's more samey than any of their movies before. And it's very much a very Marvel Studios made film, more so than their usual choice of a different kind of director taking on a superhero movie. This feels more like the regular superhero origin story that we're all kind of sick of, and showing how that genre in itself is almost played out and boring, and probably why a film like last summer's Guardians of the Galaxy was such a hit, because it didn't do that at all while still being the first Guardians of the Galaxy movie. It didn't feel like an origin story, it felt like something new and fresh. And Ant-Man, although there's never been a superhero like him, you can definitely distinguish him from various superheroes on those levels. In terms of the film structure, this feels like so many superhero movies we've seen before, and that's kind of not exactly what we expect from Marvel, especially at a time where they're pushing comic book continuity in so many different cinematic directions than we were used to. This feels like their assignment origin story movie that they just kind of put out because they had to. At a company called Pym Technologies, Darren Cross, played by Corey Stoll, is making a new suit called the Yellow Jacket suit that can shrink a man to the size of an insect to fight in various battles, much like an Ant-Man suit that Henry Pym, played by Michael Douglas, designed before, but hid away with his Pym particles that he also designed, and so no one could figure out how to do it before. But Darren Cross has figured out how to do it with his Yellow Jacket suit and is going to try to sell them for military use. Henry Pym doesn't want this to happen, as he has hidden these secrets for a reason, feeling like this would destroy man and cause chaos. So he goes about trying to find someone who can break in and stop this, and he finds Scott Lang, played by Paul Rudd. And Scott Lang has just come out of prison, and he is a very smart guy. He has a master's degree in electrical engineering, and he most notoriously robbed a major corporation and gave their money back to their people who they were overcharging. So Henry Pym knows, even though he is a thief, he has his heart in the right place. So after Scott Lang tries to rob Henry Pym, eventually comes on his side to help him come and steal the Yellow Jacket suit and stop that technology from getting out and ruining the world like most superhero villains try to do. The main thing with this movie, I guess, is that this was supposed to be an Edgar Wright movie. Edgar Wright spent a long time developing it at two different studios even, and was probably the main reason this film went as far as it did, got developed as far as it was, and even got made, is probably because of Edgar Wright. Marvel maybe would have eventually gotten around to it, but I don't think they would have made this kind of a movie without him developing it. I mean, literally, the first Comic-Con panel for Marvel Studios had 3 directors, and one was the guy who did The Incredible Hulk, which is the other Marvel Studios film that had notoriously bad time creatively. Jon Favreau and Edgar Wright, all together with Kevin Kevin Feige, it's taken this long to actually get the film made. And sure, of course, I would like this Edgar Wright movie that never happened, that in my mind would be really good, but we're all kind of just imagining a movie that didn't actually happen. There are certain sequences that look like Edgar Wright at least came up with the idea, and there's certain sequences that I can, just from knowing his filmography and having seen Space, I would say definitely were ideas that Edgar Wright came up with, but we don't actually really know. And I've seen films that like a certain director has gotten close to directing or directed a couple sequences in and couldn't end up directing, and you end up looking at the film and picking out certain things and going, well, I know this director pretty well and I'm pretty sure this shot is them. And unless you have like the director actually saying that, you don't really know. And I've noticed sometimes you can actually be wrong about those things just because you're just guessing. I don't think Peyton Reed is necessarily a bad choice. He's kind of an interesting director, and I think Down with Love was an odd idea for a romantic comedy, and probably one of the few kind of auteurish romantic comedy films, making a romantic comedy more of like a 1960s Doris Day comedy. And even The Breakup, which was making a major studio comedy about just a breakup, is pretty interesting idea. I always thought it was like La Notte meets Old School. And I like Peyton Reed, actually. I always thought he was an interesting director. I don't think he's an amazing director, but I don't know if this film really shows him off that well. He wasn't really known before for doing special effects stuff. I don't really want to fault it just because Edgar Wright wasn't involved. Certainly I was pissed off that that didn't happen too. That movie didn't happen. I'm sure it would have been better. Sure, why not? But it just didn't happen. So getting upset about something that's fictional like that just to me seems a little silly. I know that's a lot of reviews talk about how thinking about what could have happened, but there is a rule in film criticism and in criticism in general that you're not supposed to really review something on what it's not. You're supposed to review something on what it is. How what it is like shows why it should have had some of those things in it, but not saying like, well, it would have been better if it's this thing that's like kind of not tangible. It doesn't really work and hold a lot of water, and to me is kind of a little bit of like trying to find an angle. There was a sequence where Michael Pena is going through how he heard a certain thing about a job through this person to that person to that person that feels very Edgar Wright to me. There was another thing where they're fighting and a song plays on an iPhone that feels very Edgar Wright. The part where it goes from person to person to person, that felt very Edgar Wright and almost directed in an Edgar Wright way, even though he wasn't there. But the fight sequence, that felt like it could have been more inspired. In that part, you are thinking about, oh, I think Edgar Wright could have done a better job. But in general, you're thinking, I wish this sequence was better. So it kind of negates all Edgar Wright thing, because you're like, in this fictional world, Edgar Wright could have directed this better. I'm like, yeah, well, I'm sure Cecil B. DeMille would have made a better Ant-Man movie too, but I'm not going to lament about that. But I think one of the things that you can call this direction on is that it feels so much like an origin story. Marvel has even said they don't want to do origin stories more, and even said like Doctor Strange and movies that haven't come out yet supposedly won't be as much. When you look at Ant-Man, they're trying to set up all these things and set up Hank Pym and set up Scott Lang and all these things about the suit, but it kind of almost forgets to do the cool thing that Marvel movies do. It's like Thor's not just a superhero movie, it's like a fantasy film with a superhero film. Both the Captain America films are like, it's not just a Captain America movie like the first one's World War II fantasy pulp thing along with the superhero origin story, and that really worked. But the second Captain America movie that's like a 70s or 90s kind of like spy action kind of a movie, like In the Line of Fire or 3 Days of the Condor, it's influenced by a different genre and is being a superhero movie. And Ant-Man, it had some heist elements in it. There was certainly heists going on. Felt like it was more superhero movie than heist movie. Peyton Reed came on this movie late. The direction feels like someone who came on a movie that was developed by like somebody else. It really feels that way, regardless if I knew it or not. If I didn't know it, I would think that while watching it. And it feels very studio controlled, and it feels like things had to be moved around and cut out. And it feels like there's way too many cooks in the kitchen. That's one of the biggest problems with Ant-Man, is I wish it had more of that different kind of genre combined with the superhero thing. I thought that's what made Marvel movies feel so special. The only ones that are like straight superhero are really the Avengers, but it didn't seem to be as good at doing the origin kind of genre thing. And I like all the stuff it sets up with the Marvel continuity, and I actually did have fun with it. I really liked it, but when I thought about it more, I was like, I don't know. I mean, I knew it wasn't one of those Marvel movies I was gonna end up buying on Blu-ray. If you've watched enough of my reviews, you know if I like a superhero movie, I'm gonna text my dad and recommend it, and I was kind of like, you should see it, but it wasn't like a glowing endorsement. It was kind of like, it's alright, it's fine. That's the thing with Ant-Man. It's like, you'll have a good time, it's fun, but it's like, you've seen this before. I've seen so many of these superhero origin story things, and this just doesn't feel as incredible as it usually is. It doesn't feel as astonishing. It doesn't feel like I've reach this new height of superhero moviedom, it feels kind of like they toned it down and went in more of a generic route with it. They didn't think about what made these things special. It's like they almost felt like they did in a way to just kind of save it, and in a way saving it made it more boring and more like a normal superhero movie. And the thing about the Marvel Studios films is like they're not like normal superhero movies. That was never their thing. They're unique to each of those characters. It feels like a relic of Phase 1, and even in Phase 1 I would say the same things. Maybe I wouldn't be as hard on it. The continuity elements to it and the thing they're doing with Hank Pym I kind of like, but those are elements I think Marvel's built upon and made really solid. But doing a film like this at this point feels like beneath them. I do still think it's fun, and it's not as bad as like the Ninja Turtles movie at doing a particular origin story, but I did laugh a lot. And I know Adam McKay helped write this also, and Paul Rudd. I think Paul Rudd's the only Marvel superhero with a writing credit on his movie. I didn't really see much of Edgar Wright. I didn't see much of Peyton Reed, or it was hard to get anyone's distinct style out of this, more so than any Marvel movie. There are a lot of people contributing ideas to it, and that feels kind of sad. I mean, obviously we all knew that was going to happen with this movie. It shows like they can make a pretty serviceable, fun origin story, but just not one that's going to excite me. I'm not as apathetic as I am with Thor, but I'm certainly not very excited for anything else with Ant-Man. This is probably a difficult movie for Marvel to make it different from the superhero pack, and there's certain elements it does. The shrinking and the macro photography I think is pretty cool, and I think they do a good job with that. I think the whole origin story guise that this movie was made within never really made it really break out. They had a lot of fun with it. I think it was a fun movie. If you're into the Marvel films, I would recommend it, and I think you'll have a good enough time by the time Fantastic Four comes out. I don't know if you'd still be thinking about it, and I don't think I will probably. It was just like an enjoyable, regular kind of summer movie experience, and that's kind of not exactly what I expect from Marvel at this point. It did feel very much like a comic book in certain respects, certainly with the Falcon cameo, which felt more like just getting a cameo in there a little bit, but I thought it was a pretty fun sequence regardless of that, and it did help prove him as a superhero. But there were too many elements of this film that just kind of felt cut in and through too many different creative minds and kind of all mushed together. It's not the disaster it really could have been, and I think that shows how good of a studio Marvel is, but it also kind of shows them in kind of like that old Hollywood way where they knew how to get the film to work enough so they could make money on it and get it out of their hair and move on to the next one. Ant-Man felt too much like that. What Peyton Reed did in Ant-Man doesn't distinguish itself from the superhero pack, and Ant-Man just feels like kind of an ordinary, like what I used to see with comic book movies and go, you know, I know this is what they have to do, and that doesn't feel as fun, that doesn't feel as different, that doesn't feel as interesting. I feel like most of this review I'm kind of shitting on it. I think it's decent enough at what it's doing, it's just what it's doing is kind of boring. So if you have seen Ant-Man and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to. And if you would like to check out my reviews of the other films in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, then there will be an annotation below and the playlist will lead you to them. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you next time.